All right, so here's what I'm thinking.
Okay. Cut it. All right, this isn't a military drill.
Okay.
What we're trying to do is elevate Matt's Rugrats monologue. So this is
Okay.
important stuff, and we need maybe a funkier beat.
I think I got it.
Okay.
Listen to this one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, that's it. DJ Jazzy Jeff meets Mark Mothersbaugh. This is the 90s vibe we needed.
Okay,
Pat's gonna love it.
let's practice.
Let's do it.
1, 2, 3, hit it.
Brought to you by Raycon. Welcome to Locking It Down, the show that now looks more professional than every other late night talk show out there. What's that, Seth Meyers? You're doing your show in an attic crawl space? Well, as you can see, I'm doing mine from beautiful New York City, baby. Jake, take it away.
Oh, it's a Pat's Talk Show, episode 3. Hit it.
Thanks, buddy. So, beard update. Based on the overwhelming response from last week's episode, I have trimmed my mustache hairs to make eating a bit less annoying, but the beard is untouched and still growing rapidly. Scientists predict that at this rate, I should reach a full Alan Moore by the middle of the summer. We'll see. Our top story this week, McTiernan Mania continues and also concludes, so sorry, no Die Hard episode. Last week, I made the bold claim that John McTiernan might be the most important American action director of the last 50 years. So let's talk about that. Recently, my nemesis, John Krasinski, put out a new episode of his YouTube talk show featuring Steven Spielberg. Clearly a move designed to make me look bad after I repeatedly mocked his audio quality. But over here on Locking It Down, we are unfazed because we've got our own celebrity guest. Here to discuss the career of John McTiernan is my dad, Hank Willems. Dad, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Patrick. It's good to be here.
So how have you been?
Well, I've been grand. I mean, really feeling well, getting a lot of work done.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on the filmography of John McTiernan?
Please refresh my memory. I don't know.
Well, this is an installment in our series McTiernan Mania, and today we're discussing the movie The Hunt for Red October. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I've seen that film. It's a pretty good film.
Cool. Well, Hanks, thank you so much for being here. Hank Willems, everybody.
One of these days, we'll get him talking about woodworking. And that'll be the finest episode of whatever this talk show is called.
In this episode, I want to really look at McTiernan's directing in The Hunt for Red October and how he elevated material from what it was on the page. The movie is a tense Cold War submarine thriller, so you're probably asking, are we going to talk about editing, or visual storytelling, or the use of color in Jan de Bont's cinematography? No, we're not. We're going to talk about language and subtitles.
Ugh, Pat, are we really going to do a whole video about subtitles? It's so boring.
Just do your goddamn job, Jake.
Oh, all right. Hit it.
Much better. The Hunt for Red October was released in 1990, right at the end of the Cold War. Because this tension between the US and the Soviet Union had gone on for so many decades, there was a very long tradition of Russian villains in American fiction. Stallone fought them in Rocky and Rambo. There's Red Dawn, plenty of Bond movies, and even Air Force One years after the Cold War ended. So going into The Hunt for Red October, a submarine warfare thriller set in the mid-80s, we as the audience have certain assumptions. That the Americans will be the good guys, and the Soviets will be the bad guys. This is an American movie, and that's how they work. So let's talk about subtitles. Jake?
Sure. Hit it.
If you're watching an American movie, that means it was made for an English-speaking audience, and outside of very few exceptions, the main characters will speak English. In the occasions when characters are speaking a language other than English and the dialogue is subtitled, audience members have to exert the tiniest bit more effort to understand them. As Bong Joon-ho put it in one of his many Oscar acceptance speeches, subtitles are a 1-inch barrier. It's so small, barely an inconvenience, but it is still a little barrier that does not exist with English dialogue. So when you're watching an American movie in which multiple languages are spoken, this has a small subconscious effect on us. We will naturally connect more to the characters speaking our language, since the film is putting the other characters at a slight distance via that language barrier. For instance, in the new Netflix film Extraction, directed by Sam Hargrave, most of the movie is set in India. The main character, played by Chris Hemsworth, speaks English, obviously, but when it comes to the Indian characters, the bad guys speak exclusively in Hindi, subtitled into English, the good guys speak English, and the one guy who switches sides throughout the movie speaks a mix of Hindi and English when talking to his family.
I'm all he's got. You understand?
It's a little trick the movie is playing, connecting us emotionally to the protagonists while distancing us a little bit from the antagonists. So when Red October begins, it's the same way. The Americans are speaking English, duh, and the Soviets speak Russian, subtitled into English. The filmmaking is telling us that, as we expected, the Americans are the good guys and the Soviets are the bad guys. On the one hand, you've got Alec Baldwin as Jack Ryan, saying goodbye to his wife and daughter, their home bathed in warm lamplight. He seems like a really good guy. We like him. And then you've got the introduction of Captains Ramius and Borodin, the main Soviets. They're all dressed up in full military uniforms aboard a nuclear submarine, framed against the frigid Russian landscape, a cold color palette, and Basil Polidorus' ominous score playing over top. All of the cinematic language here is telling us these are the bad guys. And as the story gets moving, it seems to be about Jack Ryan and the Americans trying to stop Captain Ramius and the Soviets from launching an attack on the US. And then, 15 minutes and 18 seconds into the film, everything shifts. And it all comes down to language. As we've established, the Soviets are speaking Russian with English subtitles. And then we've got this scene where one of the Soviet political officers visits Ramius in his cabin aboard the titular Red October submarine. He picks up a book Ramius has on the table, and from it he reads a quote from the Book of Revelations. As he reads this quote, the camera zooms in until it's a close-up on his mouth, as he says the word Armageddon.
Nazywajmy po-evreski Armageddon.
Now, the thing about Armageddon is that other than being one of the 2 Michael Bay films in the Criterion Collection, it's also a word that is the same in both English and Russian. So amongst all the Russian words we hear, this one we understand. And then, in the same shot, the camera zooms back out to its original position, but now this guy is speaking in English.
And the 7th angel poured forth his bowl into the air, and a voice cried out from heaven.
It's like the movie switched on a universal translator from Star Trek or the TARDIS's translation circuit from Doctor Who. And from that point forward, all of the Soviet characters in the movie we see speaking English.
He invented the atomic bomb, and he was later accused of being a communist.
So, what's the point? Is this just John McTiernan going, hey, I know subtitles suck and reading is for squares, so let's get rid of those? No, it's not that at all. See, this moment is changing the entire perspective of the movie and revealing to us exactly what it's doing. For the first 15 minutes, we've assumed the Soviets are the villains of the movie. They're not speaking our language, they're presented as cold and dangerous, but here, as the camera zooms in, it's bringing us closer to them, making us look closer until we're all speaking the same language. The film is removing that 1-inch barrier of subtitles. We're no longer being kept at a distance from the Soviets. The movie is telling us that we're meant to empathize with them because they're not the villains. Why does this shift happen on the word Armageddon? Because that is the actual villain of the movie. It doesn't matter what language you speak, Armageddon is the same either way. This is not a story about defeating the Soviets. It's a story about communicating with those who you perceive to be your enemy for the greater good of preventing nuclear Armageddon. It is the entire point of the movie contained in one moment. See, the thing you have to remember is John McTiernan is good at this shit. And it gets even more interesting from there. I'll explain why right after this break for another installment of our hilarious Man on the Street segment, Let's Get Coconuts, with special correspondent Charles. Classic Charles. There's no one like him. Now, here on Locking It Down, we never half-ass things. Instead, we commit way too hard to a degree that is frankly unnecessary and that most would consider stupid. See, I wanted to know what this scene looked like in the original script and whether or not the language change was written in. So on the internet, I found a PDF of a draft of the script by Larry Ferguson. It's pretty similar to the final film in structure, but contains some different dialogue. For instance, this scene has the Soviet political officer reading an entirely different quote from the book. The word Armageddon is never used, and there's nothing mentioned in the script about any language changes at all. The Soviet dialogue is written just the same as the Americans. On the page, there is nothing noteworthy about this scene. But this wasn't good enough for me. I wanted to know more. So I bought a copy of the script that was used during production of The Hunt for Red October, dated June 20th, 1989. Scripts for big Hollywood movies tend to constantly be changing, and what's great about this copy is that the pages have the exact dates marked that they were revised. The front page says that unless noted, this is the draft from February 3rd, 1989. The non-revised pages are identical to the earlier draft I found, so we can call that one the February draft. But now let's skip to page 15 and see what the language shifting scene looks like here. The note at the top says this page was revised on May 14th, and here it is identical to the finished film. It's the same Bible quote. The word Armageddon is there. It even describes the camera movement and shift in language. So what does this tell us? Well, McTiernan was hired to direct the movie in fall 1988, and a script by Ferguson already existed. The film began shooting in April 1989, so it was under McTiernan's supervision that this scene was altered. If we go by the date marked on the page, this change happened during production of the movie. Sometimes people ask what a director brings to a movie that they didn't write themselves. This. Right here, this is it.
All right, you've sold me. That cinema studies major certainly is being put to good use. Let's go.
On the commentary track, and yeah, I listen to commentary tracks because I'm a big ol' nerd, physical media forever, McTiernan notes that he stole the move of zooming into a character's mouth and changing languages from the 1961 Stanley Kramer movie Judgment at Nuremberg.
Der anerkannte Sinn dieses Gerichts
The avowed purpose of this tribunal
is broader than the visiting of retribution on a few men.
Also, not to dunk on McTiernan, who I love, but in the commentary, he mistakenly says Fred Zinnemann directed Judgment at Nuremberg, which I'm sure is one of those things where he realized his mistake right after he recorded it, and now it haunts him forever. It's the thing that happens to me with literally every video I make. McTiernan would use a very similar trick 9 years later in The 13th Warrior. The film's protagonist, played by Antonio Banderas, speaks English throughout the film. Not because a guy from 10th century Baghdad would speak English, but because this is an American movie made for American audiences. He ends up traveling with a bunch of Vikings, whose language he doesn't understand. Since the story is told from his perspective, the Vikings all speak Icelandic with no subtitles, so we don't understand them either. But then, in one scene, we see Banderas watching them and studying their language. The film cuts from close-ups of his face to shots of the Vikings that get tighter and tighter as he focuses on what they're saying. As the scene goes on, certain phrases out of their mouths are said in English.
They got to steal 2 of 12 horses.
And by the end of the scene, all their dialogue has changed to English.
We can find some peace.
So then he says, "Do not foretell me wife."
We watch him learn their language, and now we understand them just as he does. Guys, as I said before, John McTiernan is good at this shit. You know who else is good at stuff? Matt Torpy. And by stuff, I mean talking about the decline of popular 90s cartoon Rugrats. So we'll be right back after another installment of Matt Whines.
They had a live-in-home grandfather, patriarch figure who was always a little bit disappointed in his son, always a little bit proud, who was antagonistic and kind of horny in a similar vibes to Master Roshi. You had Dee Dee, and this is directly from, I believe, one of the animators or the voice actor of Dee Dee saying she tried to channel her overbearing Jewish mother. You know, you have Stu living in the shadow or competitive sort of relation to his older brother and his wife, who are both a power corporate couple who are raising the main antagonist of the show, Angelica, a spoiled young girl who I guess is still young enough to speak to the babies. The language stuff is unclear, and we'll get to that later. What spoke to me and resonated with me was the babies were all like able to see the world kind of as it was. They would never lose sight of reality, but they were able to kind of, with their minds and imaginations, transform it into a larger and stranger place. You know, a skill that a lot of people try and like spend a lot of time getting back to. There was an edge to it. The world wasn't nice. Chucky's mom was dead, and you never really figured out why. Or I don't remember if you did or not.
Thanks, Matt.
Rich, can we give Matt a round of applause here? Mm-hmm. That sounds real.
Okay, so now let's skip ahead about 90 minutes. All this time, you know the movie is building to a scene where Captain Ramius and the Soviets are gonna meet Jack Ryan and the Americans. Our two main characters have to come face to face. Now, this whole time we've been hearing them both speaking English, but really we know the Soviets are speaking Russian. So what do you do here? How do we show them talking to each other? The key thing McTiernan does here is focus on perspective. The language we hear depends on whose perspective we're in at the time. The scene begins with the Americans. We follow them boarding the Soviet submarine, and from their perspective, the Soviets are speaking Russian. This time, though, there are no subtitles. The Americans don't speak the language, so the audience doesn't understand it either. Suddenly, this ratchets up the tension. We want these people to understand each other and work out an agreement, but now they can't communicate. We see the Soviets as the Americans do, as potential enemies who could be saying literally anything. Classic Tower of Babel scenario. The first shift in communication is nonverbal. Jack Ryan gestures to a Soviet asking for a cigarette. It's just a physical gesture, but it's something universal that they all understand. And as Ryan takes the cigarette and this small bond is formed, now the Russian dialogue becomes subtitled.
Смотри, позеленел чуток.
It's a step forward in understanding. The playing field isn't even yet, but it's getting there. And then McTiernan uses a similar trick as in the earlier scene. Ramius says a line to Borodin in Russian, but the last word in the line is another word that's the same in English and Russian, and at this word, Jack Ryan laughs. In this scene where you have a tense standoff between opposing militaries from opposite sides of the earth who can't communicate, the moment in which they connect and empathize with each other comes via a word they both share. And here, we learn that Jack Ryan can speak a bit of Russian.
Немного.
For a couple lines, he and Ramius speak via subtitled Russian, and then they both shift to English.
brotherly.
It is.
The film lets us know that they're still really speaking Russian, since Commander Mancuso clearly can't understand, but now our two protagonists are finally on the same level. They're speaking the same language as the audience. Contact has been established. The language barrier no longer matters. When the film cuts to a bunch of Soviet sailors in a life raft, they're speaking Russian subtitled into English, to indicate to the audience that they're excluded from the conversations and don't know what's going on. But back on board the submarine, the peaceful agreement the protagonists spent the entire movie seeking has been reached. Everyone is speaking the same language since they're all on the same side. Success!
Woo! Hit it!
So this brings our two-part McTiernan Mania series to an end. He's a director who had a truly unreal run. In a little over a decade, he changed action cinema and made between 3 and 6 bona fide classics, depending on who you ask. That run sadly ended with some big flops, a prison sentence, and bankruptcy. But according to recent interviews, he seems ready to get back in the game. John McTiernan is overdue for a comeback, so to all those studio executives who are definitely watching this YouTube video, come on. What are you waiting for? But don't close that tab just yet. One of our favorite segments, Jake's Politics Corner, is coming up next. As soon as I tell you about the sponsor for this episode. Oh hey, don't mind me. I was just putting in my cool new Raycon earbuds. Raycon is our sponsor for this episode, and they were kind enough to send me over a pair of their everyday E25 earbuds. I've been wearing them constantly around the house, listening to music while reading or writing, and listening to podcasts as a distraction when my parents are telling me long, boring stories about the 1970s.
Hey!
I've been using these every day for the past week, and I gotta say, I love them. They come in this cool little case that charges them and turns them on just by opening it. They've got 6 hours of battery life and come in a bunch of different colors. And they're so small and discreet that my parents don't even notice I'm wearing them while they try to talk to me about the gardening they're doing.
Patrick, that's very rude.
Raycon earbuds start at half the price of any other premium wireless earbuds on the market. And now you can get an additional 15% off if you go to buyraycon.com/Patrick Willems, or use the link in the description.
Damn, you know what? Actually, you might have a point there. Let's go. I want to ask your thoughts on the filmography of John McTiernan.
You keep throwing non sequiturs at me. I mean, I didn't mean to be aggressive, but I don't know John McTiernan's work. I don't study, film to the level that you do. And so, unfortunately, once again, I draw a blank.
Yeah. Pat, I'm sorry I doubted you there. That was a good point. A good video thingy. Ha ha! Damn. I'm thinking. Damn. Jeez. Okay. Hit it. I fucked it up. You're blowing my mind with all that talk about subtitles, buddy. Hit it.